The smile didn't reach his eyes. That's what people notice first. Not the slower walk, not the careful way he held himself, it was the smile. King Charles III stepped out to greet the crowd like he had done hundreds of times before. The setting was calm. The crowd was ready. Everything looked exactly as it should. But something was wrong. He smiled on cue. And it disappeared just as fast. There was no warmth behind it. No sense of ease. Just a quick flash of expression, gone before it could settle. His eyes looked tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. People noticed. They didn't say it out loud right away, but they noticed. This is the story of what was really happening behind those closed palace doors. What the royal family knew, when they knew it, and why, for months, the world was kept in the dark. What you're about to read is pieced together from royal observers, journalists who covered his appearances closely, and the quiet pattern of events that, looking back now, told the whole story before anyone was ready to hear it. Let's talk about what really happened, because the signs were there long before the announcement came. It started with small things. During a routine public appearance, Charles moved differently. Not dramatically. Nobody could point to one single moment and say that's it. It was subtler than that. His steps were measured, almost careful, like a man quietly managing his own strength. When he waved to the crowd, the gesture felt lighter than usual. Less energy behind it. For a man known for steady, consistent presence over decades, even that small change stood out. Those who had watched him for years exchanged quiet glances. His posture told its own story too. There were moments when he stood fully upright, composed, every inch the king. And then, without warning, his shoulders would drop slightly. His stance would soften. It came and went like waves, brief moments where the effort of holding everything together seemed to show through. Then he'd pull himself back, and the image would return. These weren't dramatic collapses. They weren't scenes. They were quiet, almost invisible, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were paying very close attention, or if you already had a reason to be worried. People began to have reasons to be worried. What made it harder to ignore was the atmosphere around him. Witnesses who attended these appearances described a strange tension in the air. Nothing was openly wrong, nothing anyone could name. But something felt off. People exchanged looks. Security maintained their usual positions. Everything appeared controlled. And yet, something was missing. Some quality of ease, of normalcy, that had always been there before. The absence of ease is sometimes louder than any visible disturbance. Behind the scenes, the silence from the palace made everything feel heavier. No explanations. No context. Just the same controlled public image, carefully maintained. And that image, day by day, was starting to show its cracks. What many people don't know is that by this point, those closest to the king had likely already understood that something serious was unfolding. The public was still guessing. But inside those walls, the picture was becoming clearer. And it would stay hidden for much longer than anyone expected. King Charles III had spent his entire life in the spotlight. From childhood, his every move was documented, analyzed, debated. His marriage to Diana became one of the most watched, and most painful, royal stories in modern history. His relationship with Camilla, first secret and then slowly made public, had taken decades to be accepted. By the time he became king in September 2022 following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, he had already lived more public scrutiny than most people could imagine surviving. He was 73 when he took the throne. Not a young man by any measure. And yet, he committed fully. His schedule was packed. His calendar was filled with engagements, meetings, ceremonial duties, foreign visits. For someone stepping into the most demanding role in British public life at that age, he showed no signs of slowing down. Journalists who covered the early months of his reign described him as focused, present, and clearly determined to prove himself worthy of a crown he had waited his entire life to wear. That's what made the changes, when they came, feel so significant. It started with the schedule shifts. At first, they seemed routine. Large royal calendars change often, timing adjustments, travel considerations, rescheduling for practical reasons. The palace released simple statements. Words like adjustment and rescheduling were used. Nothing that demanded alarm. But the adjustments kept coming. Events that had been confirmed, not optional appearances, but important royal duties, began disappearing quietly, one after another. And each time, the explanation was brief, careful, and short on actual detail. Royal observers who follow these schedules closely started keeping track. What once seemed like occasional flexibility started looking like a pattern. A pattern is just coincidence until it isn't. Other members of the royal family began stepping forward. Queen Camilla maintained her schedule with steady calm. Prince William began appearing at engagements that, in another time, would have included his father. The shift was gradual enough that it could be explained away, and the palace certainly didn't offer any other explanation, but those watching closely felt it. William's increased presence wasn't announced. There was no statement saying the Prince of Wales was taking on additional responsibilities. It simply happened. He was there when Charles was not. He spoke in spaces where silence had taken over. Quietly, carefully, the structure of royal duties was adjusting itself in real time. Insiders at the time described the mood within palace circles as controlled but tense. Those words matter. Controlled suggests deliberate management. Tense suggests something that needed to be managed. Meanwhile, Prince Harry remained completely separate from all of it. His absence, both physical and emotional, from the family during this period added another dimension to the story. While others increased their presence, he stayed distant. That contrast became part of the wider picture. On one side, steady duty, careful appearances, composed faces. On the other, distance and silence. The full picture was assembling itself. Nobody had announced it. But it was there, for those willing to look. Then came the moment that made looking away impossible. Late one evening, in a residential area connected to King Charles III, something happened that the palace could not quite contain. An ambulance was seen leaving a royal residence under heavy security. It wasn't part of any public plan. There had been no mention of medical activity earlier that day. The vehicle moved quickly but carefully, surrounded by a level of protection that communicated, without a single word, that whatever was happening was serious. This wasn't a routine call. The security presence alone made that clear. What followed was not a statement. Not an explanation. Not even a denial. Just silence. The palace said nothing. And that nothing spoke loudly. When word of the sighting began to spread, it landed differently than the earlier rumors had. This wasn't a subtle shift in posture at a public appearance, or a cancelled engagement with a vague explanation. This was an ambulance, late at night, leaving a royal residence, surrounded by protection, with no one willing to say why. People who had already been watching connected the dots immediately. The slow movements during appearances. The missed duties. The tired eyes. The careful, limited statements. And now this. Journalists and royal watchers who had been tracking the quiet changes now had something concrete to point to, even if they still didn't have answers. Accounts from those who were paying close attention describe a rapid shift in tone. What had been quiet, private concern became public conversation. The mood changed. This was no longer something people were whispering about. It was something people were actively trying to understand. The palace's response, which was no response, made everything worse. There was no denial. But there was no confirmation either. The careful balance between those two positions created a vacuum, and vacuums fill themselves. Every possibility that people considered felt more serious than the last. Was it the king? Was it someone else in his immediate circle? The question remained open with nothing to close it. For those who had been watching closely, the ambulance image didn't fade. It became a symbol, A single visible moment that seemed to represent everything that had been carefully kept out of sight. The slow decline. The managed absences. The controlled silences. All of it seemed to point back to that one night. Something important was happening behind those walls. And it was being deliberately kept from public view. What made the situation even more intense was the timing. This incident didn't happen randomly. It happened during the same period when questions were already building, when the schedule adjustments had become too frequent to explain away. When the subtle physical changes had been noticed by enough people that they were no longer small. This felt connected. Not random. Not isolated. It felt like a story that had been unfolding for months, finally reaching a moment that couldn't be hidden. The full truth was still to come. But that night, the distance between what was visible and what was real grew thin enough that people could almost see through it. At 75 years old, King Charles III told the world what had been hidden for months. He had cancer. No long lead up to soften it. No careful language to reduce its weight. Just the truth, stated plainly, carried in words that landed with full force. The moment it was said, something shifted, not just in what people knew, but in how they understood everything that had come before. The missed appearances made sense now. The careful schedule adjustments made sense. The ambulance. The quiet. The controlled silence. The composed faces of family members saying nothing when people desperately wanted answers. All of it clicked into place in a way that felt both sudden and inevitable. Everything that had looked like mystery now looked like protection. Accounts from journalists and royal observers who had covered those months describe a collective moment of recognition. Looking back at specific appearances, the public walkabouts where he seemed tired, the events where his presence felt different, the careful measured steps, people saw them differently now. They were no longer unexplained anomalies. They were a man, dealing with something enormous, still showing up because showing up was what he believed his role required. The royal family's silence, which had frustrated so many people and fueled months of speculation, was reframed in that moment too. What had felt like secrecy, guarded, deliberate, almost cold in its distance, now appeared differently. It was protection. Deeply personal, deeply serious protection of a truth that wasn't ready to be shared with the world before it needed to be. That doesn't mean everyone accepted it easily. Many people had questions about timing. If this had been known for some time before the announcement, why had the public been kept in the dark for so long? Was it fair to manage an entire public narrative for months without offering any real clarity to the millions of people who followed the royal family closely? These questions didn't disappear with the announcement. In some ways, they deepened. The public reaction was immediate and layered. There was sympathy, genuine, wide, and across borders. Whatever complicated feelings people had about the monarchy, about Charles personally, about the royal family's handling of the situation, those were temporarily set aside by something more basic. A 75-year-old man had cancer. That cut through everything else. But there was also something harder to name. A kind of collective processing, happening in real time, as people went back through their memories of those months and recalibrated what they had seen. Moments that had felt uncertain now felt connected. Appearances that had seemed slightly off now seemed quietly heroic. A man maintaining public duty while carrying private weight that most people couldn't imagine. Royal observers who had followed the story throughout described the announcement as a turning point not just in how people understood the king's health, but in how they understood the institution itself. The monarchy had managed a serious, ongoing health crisis for months with extraordinary control, and whether you viewed that as impressive or troubling probably depended on what you thought the public deserved to know, and when. There were those who felt the silence had been too long. That people who care about public figures deserve honest communication, not months of carefully managed nothing. And there were those who felt the silence was simply the king, and those protecting him, trying to hold on to something private before it became everyone's business forever. Both things can be true at once. The aftermath brought its own questions. About treatment. about his ability to carry out the duties of the role, about what a king with cancer looks like, in practice, day to day, month to month, about whether the adjustments that had already quietly begun, William stepping forward, responsibilities shifting, would now become more formal, more permanent. None of those answers came immediately. What came instead was a continuation of the same careful, controlled approach that had defined the months before. Measured statements. Limited detail. A focus on stability and continuity above everything else. What this story reveals, ultimately, is something true of public life at every level. The gap between what we see and what is real is often far wider than we realize. We watch someone smile at a crowd and we think we understand. We see a schedule change and we assume we know the reason. We observe silence and we fill it with our own interpretations. The truth moves differently. Quietly, behind closed doors, under careful protection, until the moment comes when it can't stay hidden anymore. These stories provide insight into not just one family, but into what it costs to live a public life while carrying something deeply private. The weight of that gap, between what must appear stable and what is actually falling apart, is something most people will never fully see. And sometimes, by the time we do see it, the story has already been unfolding for a very long time.